A young black boy stands at the entrance of the Eddington Museum of Modern Art. He doesn't wear a name tag. He doesn't carry a press pass. Just a sketchpad, a worn-out backpack, and shoes too old for a place this polished. The receptionist looks him up and down. Her fingers hover above the keyboard but never move. He doesn't look like a guest, she whispers. A nearby colleague nods. No one's supposed to be in yet. Inside the gallery, security zooms in. On the radio, Officer Reynolds speaks calmly, without hesitation. Black kid. Colored skin. Alone. Keep watch. No questions. No welcome. No pause. Just assumption. And that's how it begins, not with shouting, not with alarms, but with a glance, a whisper, and a decision made before the boy ever said a word. The morning light spilled across the marble floors of the Eddington Museum of Modern Art, a quiet wash of gold and white that made the air feel cleaner, sharper, more expectant than usual. Outside, the city stirred with its usual rhythm, but inside the museum, time felt slower, more precise, measured in the shuffle of designer shoes, the soft buzz of intercoms, the clicks of last-minute adjustments before the doors opened for what had been called the most important exhibition of the decade. This was the grand opening of Voices of the Forgotten, a collection meant to challenge assumptions, elevate hidden voices, and celebrate unheard truths. The event had been curated with precision. The guest list was exclusive. Media outlets had been scheduled for interviews, and private tours had been arranged for art donors and social elites. Everyone knew their role. Except Elijah. He didn't enter like the others. No security escort. No ticket scan. Just a quiet push of the front door and a step into polished silence. He looked young, too young for an event like this. 14, maybe. Maybe younger. He wore no name tag, no invitation badge, no museum lanyard. Just a dark hoodie, sleeves pushed up, faded jeans with a tear at the knee, and sneakers whose soles had long since worn thin. A sketchpad rested in his hand, fingers smudged with graphite. A beat-up backpack clung to one shoulder, its zipper broken and held together with a loop of string. He paused for only a second, looking straight ahead toward the tall inner doors of the gallery. Then he walked. No hesitation. No glancing around to admire the space. No awe. Just stillness. Intention. Focus. Behind the front desk, a young receptionist watched him approach. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, then paused. Something about him made her lean to the side, toward a nearby colleague. She whispered under her breath, "He doesn't look like a guest." The colleague glanced up and followed her gaze. No one's supposed to be in yet. But Elijah was already past them. Inside the gallery, the lights were dimmed to just the right level. Ambient music drifted from hidden speakers, wrapping around sculptures and paintings with curated grace. Elijah stepped into that silence, opened his sketchpad, and began to draw. In the museum's security office, a man named Reynolds was leaning over a screen. His job wasn't to question, just to watch. But when he saw the boy alone, in the middle of a private gallery, dressed like that, skin like that, he reacted. He pressed his radio. Black kid. Colored skin. Alone. Keep watch. No questions. No context. No curiosity. Just assumption. From that point on, Elijah wasn't a visitor. He wasn't a student. He wasn't even a child. He was a profile. A threat. A mistake waiting to happen. The cameras zoomed in tighter. One on the entrance. One on the hallway. One directly above him, capturing his every move. They watched his hands, his bag, his clothes. Not the sketches he was making. Not the patience in his eyes. Not the calm. To the museum, Elijah had entered the wrong place in the wrong body. And still, he said nothing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make demands. He didn't explain who he was. Because he knew the truth. They'd already decided. And that was how it began, not with shouting, not with alarms, but with a glance, a whisper, a label spoken into a radio. It was still morning. The exhibit had not yet opened. The guests had not yet arrived. The speeches had not yet been made. But the damage had already begun. Elijah walked deeper into the gallery, the kind of space that demanded silence, though his own silence was not a demand, it was natural. He didn't drift aimlessly like many visitors. He didn't pull out a phone, didn't take selfies, didn't move quickly from one piece to the next. He walked slowly, purposefully, with the quiet focus of someone who didn't just see art, he understood it. He stopped in front of a large canvas, nearly 8 feet tall, with bold strokes of red across a background of deep gray. The average visitor might have looked for 30 seconds before moving on. Elijah stayed. 1 minute passed. Then 2. His eyes followed every motion the artist must have made. He blinked slowly, processing it layer by layer, like he was letting the painting speak first. Then he opened his sketchpad. His pencil didn't move in quick, showy gestures. It danced gently, almost reverently, over the page. A curved line, a short phrase scribbled in the corner. The sound of graphite on paper was barely audible, but it was there, steady, unbothered. The boy wasn't copying. He was responding. Translating. Engaging. A gallery assistant passed behind him, paused briefly, and kept walking, but not before shooting him a lingering glance. Another woman, older, stopped to adjust her scarf. She noticed him crouched by a sculpture, sketching intently. She frowned, leaned toward her husband. "He's probably casing the place," she whispered. Her voice was low, but not low enough. The man didn't answer. He just gave Elijah one long, narrow, eyed look before moving on. Elijah's hand paused for a second. He'd heard. Of course he had. He always did. But he didn't turn his head. Didn't meet their eyes. He just resumed sketching. The lines were slower now, more deliberate. He was still processing, but not their suspicion, the art. Across the building, in the small, locked security room, the monitors flickered with live feeds. One camera zoomed in slightly, capturing a top-down view of Elijah sketching. Officer Reynolds leaned closer to the screen. "Loiterer by Sculpture Hall," he said into the radio. "Keep eyes on the kid with the bag." A second voice came through. "He's been standing too long. Colored skin, hoodie, not moving like a guest." They said it plainly. Not with urgency. Not with curiosity. Just assumption. Like it was protocol. Elijah moved to the next piece, a mixed, media collage of torn newspaper headlines. He stood in front of it longer than the last. His brows pulled together, just slightly. He turned a page in his sketchpad. Began again. In the distance, he could feel more eyes. Staff at corners. Guards pretending not to watch but clearly doing nothing else. The way their gaze lingered after he passed. The way people adjusted their bags when they walked near him. He noticed everything. He always did. But he kept his posture straight. His breathing slow. His hands steady. He didn't allow himself to shrink. Didn't quicken his pace or put his sketchpad away. There was no apology in his movements. No fear. Just presence. Calm, quiet strength. The kind built from years of being misunderstood, misjudged, mistaken. The kind that comes when you've had to learn how to hold yourself tall in rooms that try to make you small. It was not just his silence that made them uncomfortable. It was what his silence said. He had every right to be there, and he knew it, even if they didn't. Elijah had just turned the page in his sketchbook when the sound of heavy steps began to approach. Not rushed, not loud, but deliberate, the kind of pace meant to be noticed. He didn't need to look up to know they were coming for him. The air changed. It tightened. The stillness he had carried with him began to feel exposed. Officer Reynolds appeared at the edge of the gallery space, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. He took his time getting closer, walking with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't expect to be questioned. Guests nearby began to shift slightly, pretending to examine a sculpture, but really watching the space between the officer and the boy. When Reynolds finally stopped, he stood just a little too close. Elijah closed his sketchbook, looked up, and met his gaze. There was no smile. No welcome. Just a question, sharp and blunt. "What are you doing here?" Elijah didn't react the way some might expect. He didn't stammer or look down. His voice was steady. "I'm here for the exhibit." His tone was respectful, but not submissive. He gave no reason to be doubted. But doubt had already arrived before he did. Reynolds tilted his head slightly, like he didn't believe him or didn't care. "Let me see what's in your bag." The words hung in the air. They weren't yelled, but they landed heavy. Elijah hesitated, not from guilt, but from understanding. He knew what this was. He'd seen it before. Still, he stayed calm. "I'd rather not," he said, voice low but firm. "There's nothing dangerous. Just my things." It didn't matter. Without warning, Reynolds reached out and pulled the bag from Elijah's shoulder. There was no struggle, but it wasn't gentle. The zipper, already worn, gave way with a rough pull. Sketches spilled out like feathers. Some fluttered to the floor. Others slid across the marble tiles, exposed to everyone's eyes. Reynolds crouched to pick them up. He didn't look at them with care. He didn't ask what they were. He simply flipped through them like someone searching for something illegal, something threatening. He thumbed through pages filled with charcoal portraits, inked lines, graphite details that had taken hours to create. Then, carelessly, he pulled one page too hard. It ripped clean through the middle. A face Elijah had drawn, half gone. There was a pause. It wasn't long. Barely a few seconds. But it was thick. Elijah didn't move. His face didn't twist in anger. He didn't reach for the paper or demand an apology. He just stood there, still, looking straight at the officer with a gaze that was sharper than any words. Nearby, a woman lowered her phone mid-snap. A man, holding a museum guide, stopped pretending to read it. The scene had drawn attention, even if no one dared step in. Reynolds looked at the torn drawing in his hands. There was something uneasy in his posture now, but he didn't speak. And Elijah didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. He simply watched. Not as a boy who had been embarrassed, but as someone who had been through this before. Someone who had learned that strength didn't have to shout. That control could live in silence. He didn't need to say it out loud. His eyes said it for him. The silence in the gallery had shifted. It was no longer the respectful quiet of art appreciation, it was the kind of silence that followed discomfort, the kind that grew sharp around the edges. Eyes followed Elijah now, not with curiosity, but with suspicion. And the people who had once whispered were beginning to speak out loud. Another guard stepped forward, called in after Reynolds' radio check. He was bigger, more blunt, and less interested in appearances. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't look at Elijah's drawings, or the torn page Reynolds still held. He simply sized up the boy, then looked him in the eyes and said, "We don't care how polite you are. You don't belong here." The words didn't carry rage. They carried certainty. Like this wasn't about what Elijah had done, but about what he was. The sentence landed hard, not just for Elijah, but for the people around who heard it and said nothing. Just then, a woman standing near the entrance to the next gallery spoke, as if needing to add her voice to the growing narrative. She was white, her coat pressed, her purse clutched tightly under one arm. "He's clearly up to something," she said, without even looking at Elijah. "He's been standing around too long. Watching. That's what they do." It wasn't said with fear, but with dismissal. As if this kind of accusation didn't even require evidence, just a glance. Elijah bent down to gather the last of his scattered sketches. One had folded over, caught beneath a bench. He reached for it carefully, brushing off a scuff from a shoe print that didn't belong to him. His fingers moved gently, almost tenderly, as if the paper itself was alive. Then he stood. Straight. Balanced. Not defensive, not confrontational. Just still. "You messed with the wrong one," he said, quietly. He didn't say it like a threat. He said it like a fact. Reynolds bristled. The second guard shifted beside him, arms folded across his chest. "Respect isn't given to kids like you," Reynolds snapped. His voice was louder now, tense. "You want to be treated right, you earn it. You don't walk in here with a backpack and attitude and think you're someone." It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about ego. Some of the guests began to step back. Others lingered, pretending to be absorbed in nearby art while stealing glances toward the center of the storm. One teenager, phone in hand, had started recording from behind a statue. Elijah didn't move. His expression didn't break. He just looked back at them, the same way he had looked at every piece of art in the building, with focus, and stillness, and depth. Then a new voice entered the scene. A staff member. Young, irritated, walking past quickly with a clipboard in one hand. She barely looked up, didn't slow down. But as she passed, she muttered under her breath, "This place ain't for colored skin and sketch pads." She said it like a fact. Like it had always been that way, and always would be. Elijah heard it. He didn't respond. But his hands, holding the now creased edges of his drawings, gripped just a little tighter. The gallery had turned into something else. Not a space for art, but a stage for accusation. What was once quiet discomfort had turned into public degradation. But Elijah stood in it. Not crumbling. Not shouting. Still. Grounded. Unmoved. Because he had heard worse. Because he had survived worse. Because no one in that room, no matter how loud their voices, could erase what he knew about himself. The sketchbook left Reynolds' hand with force. Not a casual toss, but something harder, something laced with frustration. It hit the museum floor with a sharp, echoing slap. The binding split open on impact. Pages burst out, sliding in every direction. Some curled beneath a bench, others fluttered like loose leaves, landing face up on the marble tile. Faces, forms, carefully drawn hands and expressions stared back from the floor, exposed, vulnerable, unprotected. There was a silence. Just long enough to let it sting. Then, a laugh. Not loud, but cutting. It came from the edge of the gallery, from a man in a blazer holding a brochure. He pointed, chuckled to his companion, and said, "Is this a performance piece?" His friend laughed too. The kind of laugh that isn't about humor, but about superiority. The kind meant to strip someone down without touching them. Elijah didn't speak. He didn't move at first. He looked down at the mess, the pages he had carried with him for months, some smudged from his own hands, others creased from use. They were more than paper. They were work. Memory. Thought. Pieces of him. The mop came next. A janitor entered from the corner hallway, moving slowly, rhythmically. He wore a neutral expression, neither kind nor cruel. But as he passed Elijah, he pushed the mop head just wide enough. A splash of murky water hit Elijah's shoes, soaking the fabric, spreading in a dark, uneven stain. The janitor didn't stop. He didn't look up. He kept moving, like nothing had happened. The message was silent, but clear. Still, Elijah didn't respond. That made it worse for the people watching. Reynolds stepped forward, his voice sharper now. Leave. Now. It wasn't a request. It wasn't about rules. It was about power. He didn't care what Elijah had drawn. He didn't care what was in those pages. He wanted him gone. Phones had come out. A few, not all. But enough. Some guests, those who had laughed before, were now recording. Not out of concern, but curiosity. The way people do when they think they're watching something that won't affect them. They stood back, holding their phones like shields, capturing the moment, but doing nothing to stop it. Elijah bent down. He started with the nearest page, lifting it gently, straightening a folded edge. His movements were slow, careful, full of the kind of tenderness that made the act feel sacred. He picked up another. Then another. He didn't flinch when water dripped from his laces. He didn't rush. There was a dignity to it, the kind that didn't shout for attention, but made it impossible to look away. The room had grown quieter. The laughter had faded. The recordings continued, but the energy had changed. Something about Elijah's silence was louder than anything Reynolds had said. When all the pages were in his arms, Elijah stood. His shoes were wet. His clothes wrinkled. But his back was straight, his eyes steady. He looked at Reynolds, not with anger, not with fear. Just certainty. His voice was soft, but it cut through the air like a razor. You don't know who I am. And that was true. Reynolds didn't know. None of them did. But they would. Elijah turned, still clutching his drawings, still holding what little dignity the morning had left him. His steps were quiet, measured, not hurried. He wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to breathe. To create space between himself and the people who had decided he didn't belong. But space, like respect, was not something they were willing to give. He hadn't made it more than a few steps when 3 guards moved to block his path. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They simply stepped forward together, wide shoulders, dark uniforms, planted feet. It wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. Like a wall closing in. Elijah stopped. He looked up at them. His hands didn't move. His eyes didn't waver. But his body stilled. Behind him, the gallery's noise had softened to murmurs. People weren't speaking anymore. They were watching. Watching the way a boy, barely a teenager, was being surrounded like a threat. Then, from the side, a woman appeared. She walked quickly, heels clicking against the floor. In her hand, a large iced drink. Her movements were casual, confident. As she passed Elijah, the drink tilted in her hand. Just enough to spill. Cold liquid splashed at his feet, soaking into the already stained shoes, seeping into the laces. "Oops," she said without stopping, her voice light, mocking, "didn't see you there." She didn't look back. And no one called her out. One of the guards, the largest of the 3, stepped forward. His hand closed around Elijah's upper arm, fingers pressing hard against the fabric of his hoodie. The grip was not gentle. It was control. Without warning, the guard yanked Elijah forward, shoving him toward the exit. The boy stumbled but kept his footing. His sketchbook slipped from under his arm. A few pages fell, landing at awkward angles on the floor. Reynolds stood by the glass doors now, one hand on the handle, the other resting on his hip. He didn't move to help. He didn't speak. From the back of the crowd, a man's voice rose, uncertain but clear. Why is he being treated like that? The voice belonged to an older guest, tall, well dressed, holding a gallery guide that now hung limp in his hand. But no one answered him. No one even looked his way. The guard shoved again, harder this time. Elijah's shoulder hit the edge of the doorway. He winced but didn't fall. The doors opened. Bright light from outside rushed in, a contrast to the dim gallery behind him. Then Elijah was pushed out. Hard. His body hit the museum's front steps. His shoes scraped against the stone. The sketchbook dropped. More pages flew, carried by wind, scattered across the sidewalk like discarded memories. Pedestrians on the street turned. A mother walking her child paused. A teenager on a scooter slowed down. But no one knew what they were seeing. No one understood. Inside the museum, the guards remained still. The door closed behind them. Outside, Elijah bent down, again, for the third time that morning, to gather his drawings. His hands moved slowly now. The edges were torn. Some pages were stained. One was missing entirely. Still, he picked them up. Still, he didn't scream. He held the torn fragments like something sacred, because they were. Because they were his. And because, even now, they were the only thing he could control. His silence was no longer just quiet strength. It was resistance. And though no one around him knew it yet, it would echo longer than any of them expected. Elijah sat alone on the museum's front steps, his back against the stone wall, his drawings tucked tightly against his chest. His clothes were soaked from the spill and the street. His shoes were stained. His fingers, once steady, now held the edges of the paper as if afraid to let go. But his posture remained upright. He didn't hang his head. He didn't cry. He simply sat, still, quiet, humiliated, yet composed. Around him, life continued. Tourists passed without noticing. A cyclist slowed at the curb, waiting for the light to change. A boy holding his mother's hand pointed at Elijah's scattered papers but was gently pulled away. No one stopped to ask what had happened. No one saw the weight behind his silence. The museum loomed behind him, tall and glass, bright, casting reflections of a building proud of its elegance. A building that had just rejected its own. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted from control to confusion. The main gallery buzzed with low conversation. Staff moved quickly, setting up the final touches for the opening. The lights had been tested. The guest list had been checked. All that was left was the arrival of the artist. Then the director entered. She walked in with purpose, expecting calm, expecting everything to be ready. She glanced at her watch, then looked around. Her eyes scanned the lobby. She didn't see him. She frowned, lowered her voice just enough to be heard by the nearby staff. "Where's Elijah Cole?" The question didn't land immediately. For a second, it floated in the room without weight. Then a staff member near the admissions desk looked up from her phone. Her response came casually, without thought. "We removed some disruptive black kid," she said, shrugging. "Security said he was causing trouble. They took him outside a few minutes ago." The director froze. Her face lost color. The clipboard in her hand dropped, hitting the floor with a loud, flat thud. Everyone turned to look. The sound echoed against the tall walls, sharp in the quiet. She stared at the staff member, then at the guards nearby. "You kicked out the featured artist," she said slowly. Her voice rose as she said it again, louder this time, each word clear and cutting. "You threw out Elijah Cole." The room stopped. Every step, every whisper, every hand movement stilled. Reynolds stepped forward. His jaw clenched. His eyes flicked down to the floor. For a moment, He didn't say anything. Then his voice came low, almost strained. I made a mistake. The words hung heavy in the air. No one moved. No one spoke. Because it was too late for explanation. Too late for apology. Outside, Elijah still sat in silence. He hadn't heard the conversation, but something in him knew. Something had shifted. And not in him. In them. The museum director didn't waste a second. She didn't stop to explain or wait for someone to catch up. Her face was flushed, her jaw tight, every step laced with urgency. She burst through the central hall into the lobby, her voice ringing across the polished walls, clear and cold. Get him back, now. Heads turned. The front desk froze. Two security guards instinctively reached for their radios, unsure whether to move or wait. But her tone left no room for hesitation. Find him, she snapped again. Immediately. Her voice cut through the room like glass. The entire energy of the building shifted. People stopped moving. Conversations dropped to whispers. The tension that had been growing quietly now cracked wide open. Guests near the entrance turned toward one another, confused at first. Then the confusion gave way to murmurs, questions passed between them like a current. Wait, the boy they kicked out, was that Elijah Cole? No way. Are you serious? He was the artist? The featured one. More people joined in. A woman near the brochure stand pulled out her phone. She had filmed the moment security forced him outside. She watched it again, her hand slowly covering her mouth. Another guest leaned in, watching the same clip. That's him, someone said. They shoved him out. Like he was nothing. Near the information desk, two teenage girls whispered behind their hands. One had been sketching earlier in the morning. Now her pencil was still, her eyes fixed on the chaos unfolding around her. Down the hall, the PR team scrambled. One assistant held a phone to each ear. Another typed frantically on a laptop, updating the official press release. One tried calling Elijah's emergency contact, while another searched for the driver who had been scheduled to bring him in. The room was filled with the sharp clicks of keyboards, the tense shuffle of papers, the unmistakable sound of panic. He's gone viral, someone said, pointing to a tablet. It's already online. The communications lead didn't look up. Damage control now. Apologies later. Meanwhile, on the gallery floor, the staff who had watched everything unfold were trying to make sense of what they'd seen. Not out loud. Not all at once. Just in fragments. In quiet shame. He never raised his voice, one whispered. Not once. He just stood there, another said. Didn't argue. Didn't fight. I thought he was just some kid. With a sketchbook. The realization settled heavy in the air. Not dramatic. Just deeply uncomfortable. At the edge of the lobby, near the security post, a guest who had witnessed everything from the beginning walked up to the same guard who had laid hands on Elijah. His tone was calm, but his words were sharp. You messed with the wrong one, he said, staring straight at him. The guard didn't answer. Didn't nod. Just lowered his gaze and stepped back into the shadows of the wall. Outside, the city kept moving. But inside, the truth was catching up fast. And no one could stop it now. The museum's front doors opened with urgency, not grace. Staff spilled out in waves, their footsteps quick, their voices low but frantic. Some had radios in hand, others phones pressed to their ears. They fanned out along the sidewalk, peering down the block, searching behind parked cars, scanning benches. They weren't sure what they were looking for, a boy, a chance, a moment they could still salvage. But they searched anyway. Inside, under the high ceilings and bright lights, the director stood in front of a podium hastily pulled into place. Cameras had arrived. Reporters from local stations held out mics. Museum staff gathered behind her, their expressions tight. The director cleared her throat. Her voice was steady, but strained. "We offer our deepest apology," she said. "To Elijah Cole. To our guests. To our city. What happened this morning was unacceptable, and we take full responsibility." The statement echoed through the gallery, but the damage was already outside. Elijah was still there. He hadn't left. He sat on the steps, just as before. His back straight. His shoulders still. His drawings rested in his lap, held gently but firmly. His eyes stared ahead, focused on nothing and everything at once. He looked untouched, but only on the surface. The boy who had arrived quietly now sat in the center of a storm. The cameras found him next. News crews shifted from the podium to the steps. Lenses zoomed in. Reporters lowered their voices. A few museum employees approached him carefully. No more orders. No more instructions. Only requests. "Elijah," one said, kneeling beside him, "we're so sorry. We didn't know." Another staff member stood behind, voice cracking with guilt. "Please, just come back inside. The exhibit's about you. The entire day is about you." Elijah said nothing. Not a word. His hands remained on the sketchbook, his fingers resting lightly on the cover. His expression didn't change. He wasn't angry. He wasn't cold. He was present, and that presence said more than any speech behind a podium ever could. Back inside, the crowd had shifted. Guests who had once whispered now voiced their thoughts more clearly. One older man stepped toward a guard who had stood silently during the confrontation. His tone was calm, but heavy with meaning. "What if that were your son?" The guard said nothing. Another woman nearby shook her head. "It wasn't a mistake," she said under her breath. "It was a decision." Staff members, once confident in their roles, now stood near the walls, unsure of where to look. The energy had changed. The authority in the room had shifted. The director returned to the lobby, surrounded by her team, her face tight with something between regret and fear. She nodded once to the communications lead. An announcement was made through the speaker system. The opening of Voices of the Forgotten would be postponed. There would be no ribbon cutting. No formal tour. No opening remarks. Just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from admiration, but consequence. Outside, Elijah remained where he was. The exhibit could wait. The world was finally seeing him. And they needed to sit with what they had done. The museum doors opened once more, this time not in panic, not in command, but in quiet invitation. The director led the way, her steps slower now, her expression marked by something deeper than formality. Behind her, two staff members flanked Elijah, not to control, not to contain, but simply to accompany. Elijah walked without looking around. His gaze remained steady, his arms folded gently around the sketchbook that had survived more than just the morning. There were no flashing lights, no dramatic music. Just footsteps and the low hum of a crowd waiting for something they didn't yet understand. The guests inside had shifted. This wasn't the same audience from an hour ago. Their eyes no longer scanned him with suspicion. They watched with stillness, unsure how to carry the weight of their silence. As Elijah passed through the gallery, heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. People who had filmed the chaos earlier now stood with their phones lowered, unsure whether to record this moment or simply witness it. The director guided him to the heart of the exhibition hall. At the far end of the room stood a tall wall, veiled behind a black curtain. It reached almost to the ceiling, the central piece of the entire event. For hours, it had remained hidden, waiting for the right moment. That moment had come. The director turned to Elijah. She didn't give a speech. She didn't explain. She simply nodded and stepped aside. Elijah approached the curtain. He stood still for a second, letting the silence settle. Then, without fanfare, he pulled the cord. The fabric slipped away. The wall behind it came into view, massive, bold, unapologetic. Letters stretched across its surface, painted in stark white, "Voices of the Forgotten, Elijah Cole, age 14." Gasps moved through the crowd like wind through leaves. The name landed with impact. Not because it was famous, but because now, it carried context. It carried weight. And then they saw the work. Rows of sketches, portraits in charcoal and ink. Figures with hollow eyes, mouths pressed shut, stories buried in texture and shadow. Pages that looked bruised, torn, but still standing. One piece showed a young boy, seated on steps, hands curled around paper. Another showed a museum hallway, lined with faceless silhouettes turning their backs. People moved closer, slower than before. Some reached for tissues. Others just stared. Then Elijah turned. He didn't step forward, didn't clear his throat. He didn't need a microphone. The room leaned in, waiting. He glanced down once, then met their eyes. "I don't speak loud," he said. "I let my art do it for me." The pause that followed was full. No one moved. Then, slowly at first, the applause began. One pair of hands. Then another. Then the entire room rose in sound, not out of politeness, but from something deeper. Something like recognition. The clapping echoed through the space, across the walls, down the marble floor. It was louder than anything that had come before, but none of it reached Elijah the way one small voice did. Near the back of the crowd, a young black boy stood beside his mother. He tugged at her coat, eyes wide, voice soft. "He looks like me," he whispered. And in that whisper, something shifted. Because Elijah was no longer just a boy with a sketchpad. He was a mirror. A voice. A beginning. The museum had returned to stillness, but it wasn't the same stillness as before. This time, it wasn't built on quiet rules or muted footsteps. It was built on the weight of what had been exposed. Somewhere in the back corridors, a voice came over the earpiece, clear, measured, final. "Send Reynolds to the director's office." The message wasn't repeated. It didn't need to be. A staff member approached him without making eye contact. "Now," she said, "nothing more." Her tone told him everything. Reynolds followed her through the same hallway he had walked earlier that morning. The paintings looked different now. He noticed the eyes in portraits watching him as he passed. He noticed people stepping aside, not in respect, but in quiet retreat. The museum no longer felt like his territory. It felt like a place that had moved beyond him. When he reached the director's office, the door was already open. She stood behind her desk, arms crossed, lips pressed in a firm line. The blinds were half closed, but the light that filtered in was harsh, unkind. "Close the door," she said. He obeyed. She didn't ask him to sit. She didn't invite him to explain. She looked at him the way someone looks at a broken part they hadn't realized was rusted through. "You're dismissed." Reynolds shifted his weight. "Director," she cut him off. "I don't want a defense." He hesitated. His voice dropped. "I didn't know who he was." There was a long pause. One that wasn't filled with sympathy, only clarity. "That's the problem," she said. And with those 4 words, everything was finished. The title, the authority, the uniform, all of it fell away. He didn't argue again. He turned, walked out of the office, and left the building he had once guarded with a kind of pride. No applause. No handshake. No ceremony. Just consequence. Outside, the world had caught up. The story was everywhere. Screens lit up with headlines before Reynolds even crossed the lobby. Young black artist removed from own exhibit. I don't speak loud, Elijah Cole's quiet resistance goes viral. Silenced, then celebrated, a museum's moment of reckoning. The images that followed were sharp. One photo showed Elijah sitting alone on the steps, sketchbook in hand. Another showed the torn page inside the gallery, displayed beneath glass. The caption beneath it read, "Not repaired. Not erased." The museum responded quickly. Press statements were released, drafted in haste, polished in legal review. The director issued a second apology, this time recorded, public, emotional. She promised change, internal reviews, cultural sensitivity training, a full restructuring of their guest protocol. But it wasn't just about damage control. It was about redemption, or at least the attempt. Meanwhile, Elijah's name surged through the internet. Artists reposted his work. Activists shared his story. Students created art inspired by his sketches. Celebrities mentioned his name. What had started as humiliation became a spotlight, one he didn't ask for, but one he stood in, fully and calmly. He didn't speak much in interviews. When he did, his answers were short, thoughtful. He still let his work speak first. And the work now lived far beyond the museum walls. Inside the gallery, the exhibit had expanded. More visitors came, not just for the art, but for the story behind it, for the stillness that had shaken something loose in all of them. Outside, Reynolds tried to leave quietly. But silence didn't protect him anymore. Cameras caught his movements. Reporters called out questions he couldn't answer. Guests turned to look as he passed, their stares saying what words no longer needed to. He kept his head down, moving faster. Then he heard it. A voice from a bench. Calm. Unshaken. Not mocking. Not cruel. Just true. Respect. Not regret. He didn't turn around. But the words followed him. Because now, he understood. And this time, there was no uniform to hide behind. What happened to Elijah wasn't just a mistake. It was a mirror. A reflection of how easily we judge, how quickly we dismiss, and how rarely we pause to ask who someone truly is. He was young, quiet, black, and alone. And for many, that was enough to make him invisible, or worse, a threat. But Elijah didn't respond with rage. He didn't raise his voice, slam a door, or demand respect. He simply stood his ground. With stillness. With grace. With quiet strength. He showed us something powerful. That you don't have to shout to be heard. That dignity doesn't require permission. And that true respect isn't about who someone becomes after fame, but how we treat them before we know their name. In a world that often rewards noise, Elijah chose silence. In a space that tried to erase him, he left a mark no one could ignore. Through every page he drew, through every moment he refused to be shaken, he gave people a choice, to see him for who he was, or to keep looking away. This isn't just a story about a boy who was misunderstood. It's a story about all the people we overlook. The quiet ones. The ones who don't fit the mold. The ones who walk into rooms and are met with suspicion before they ever speak. And it's a reminder that how we treat someone when we think they're nobody says more about us than about them. So what can we take from this? That respect isn't something to be earned through status. It should be offered through humanity. That control doesn't equal power. True power is choosing empathy when it's easier to judge. And that maybe, just maybe, we've all walked past someone like Elijah without ever stopping to see them. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or reminded you of someone who's been overlooked, share this video. Leave a comment. Start a conversation. And subscribe to this channel for more stories that challenge what we assume, and shine a light on voices that matter. Because sometimes, the most powerful voice in the room is the one that never had to raise itself.